And it's my pleasure and honor to introduce to you Professor M.Bender. Actually, we shared a lot in our career path. We crossed quite a few times, including I organized Coding 2002, and Emily just organized Coding 2018. But I think most of all, and what is really important for us in the Faculty of Humanities, having Professor Bender giving us a talk at this juncture, is really looking at how she developed her career and how linguistics and the humanities comes into play in her career. So, so she has been introduced in the public keynote speech, and then you can look at all the awards on the website. But what I want to mention is that you probably didn't know that Professor Bender wrote a MA thesis on Ba, the syntax of Ba in Chinese. And then she studied a lot also Japanese linguistics, among other things. So in this day in humanities, and especially in linguistics, we are often being criticized that what we do is not enough to do a career. And then a lot of people would go away from the humanities and do something more useful and more profitable, and then lose the sight of what they received in the training in linguistics or in the humanities. So this is taking humanities as a career, 事业, and you found that it's not a viable career path, then you give it up. But what the American Council for the Humanities and Social Science and many recent studies and many advocates of humanities had mentioned recently that actually we should take the humanities, including linguistics, as a vocation, as a 职业. So what do you do as a vocation? A vocation is what you do, what you aspire to, and what you dedicate it to, but you want to take it and make it relevant in your life. So how do you continue to have humanity as a vocation and still have a good career? That's the big question. So what Professor Bender did, I think, would be a good example. She actually went on to get her PhD in computer science. Still in linguistics, but in computational linguistics, at Stanford, but it's kind of difficult to differentiate at the Stanford linguistic department in computational linguistics, but what she has been doing ever since she developed her career in computational linguistics, even though she's been getting grants from the computer science and NS grant and science and the conferences and publications, she has been emphasizing that on focusing on what can linguistics do to help computational linguistics and language technology. So that is a very, very good example of how do you keep linguistics as your vocation while make it relevant in your career and make it relevant for the society. So I think most of all, in addition, on top of all her achievement, I think this is the lesson. This is the thought I want you to bring home based on what you learned from Professor Bender. And I hope this message would carry on through you to all our colleagues and our students. So without much ado, I welcome Professor Bender. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for that kind introduction. It inspires me to tell a story that I hadn't planned to tell, but I think it fits in well. I did not know what linguistics was when I went to the university for the first time. I'd never heard of it. But someone suggested to me that before I start my studies, I should read the course catalog and just circle anything that looked interesting, right? So in the summer before I started my studies, and just so you know exactly how old I am, that was the summer of 1991, I read the course catalog, which back then was not a web page, it was a book. And one of the classes that I circled was called an Introduction to Language. I thought, oh, that sounds cool, because I really liked studying foreign languages, right? And at that point, I'd already studied French and Japanese, and later on would study Mandarin and American Sign Language and little bits of other things here and there. But I didn't want to be a literature major. That's a fantastic major for those who are interested, but it wasn't my interest. I just wanted to understand how language works. So my second semester, spring of 1992, I took this class called An Introduction to Language, taught by Professor William S.Y. Wong, and I was hooked the very first day. I thought, this is wonderful. But it took me a whole semester to decide that that would be my major because I didn't see how it could possibly be practical. Right? How could I major in something so impractical, even though I loved it so much? Well, fast forward many years. As Professor Huang said, I have finished degrees in linguistics, and now I teach in the linguistics department, and I run a professional master's program in computational linguistics, training people for very practical jobs. And at the same time, living through this age where we see AI becoming more and more prominent, feeling every day the value of having a humanist perspective in technology. And that is very much what I'm going to be talking about today, one small piece of that. And I think it is really important for those of us in the humanities to assert the value of our way of understanding what's happening in society and what's happening in our world, and the relevance of that way of understanding it to what is often seen as the more powerful, more elite, more productive parts of society. Because we can't build technology that works for people if we don't understand people and their needs in society. And that's where humanities and social sciences are critically important. So thank you all for being here, and thank you for indulging me in that story. My title for today is It Matters Who Said It and Why, How Careful Handling of Linguistic Data Leads to Better Language Technology. And now I'm reminding myself to apologize for speaking too quickly, as I know I always do. And I would ask you to remind me from time to time. Go like this with your hand, and I will see that, and I will try to slow down. I'd like to acknowledge that a large chunk of this talk is based on work that I've done together with Batya Friedman, who's a professor in the Information School at the University of Washington, and it is forthcoming in the journal called Transactions of the Association for Computational Linguistics. So you can find that paper on my webpage, and the top bullet is our funding acknowledgement, and then we've had lots of wonderful input from people along the way. So in outline, I'm going to start with some motivations for what I'm doing, and then talk about two major things I've done in this area. The first is work around teaching ethics in the natural language processing curriculum, and then this work with Batya Friedman on data statements, which is one proposal for a best practice to help bring an understanding of people and how they are affected into technology. So, to set the scene, how many people in the room identify as a linguist? All right. Is anybody here a computational linguist? Excellent. Anybody thinks of themselves as a natural language processing person? Great. Okay, and other, just because everyone should have a chance to raise their hand. All right, so just to sort of make sure we're on the same page, here are some definitions of terms. Linguistics is, it is in the humanities, but we like to consider ourselves a science. This is the science of language. We're interested in how language works, how languages are acquired, how they are used, both sociologically and psychologically and neurologically, if you are working with the wetware, and how they vary across time and space. That's linguistics. Computational linguistics is sometimes used synonymously with natural language processing. And if you asked me 3 or 4 years ago, I would say, oh yeah, they're the same thing. It just depends on who you are. If you're in the linguistics department, you call it computational linguistics. If you're in a computer science department, you call it NLP. And if you're in an electrical engineering department, you call it speech processing, right? But I kind of think that maybe they're different, all right? So computational linguistics is the field that is interested in using computational methods to answer the questions of linguistics. Right, so we're still interested in those questions in that first bullet, but we're using computers to help us answer them. Natural language processing is about using computers to process speech or text for practical applications, possibly research, but not really research in linguistics, but research in political science, or research in economics, or research in biomedical science, and so on. There's lots of possible applications. So these are two closely related but distinct fields. They're often using the same methods. They share publication venues to a certain extent, but they have different goals. So this collection of two fields is supposed to be interdisciplinary, and I think historically it was much more interdisciplinary than it is now. And it has been historically this meet point, right, for scholars across linguistics, computer science, electrical engineering, biomedical informatics, and so on. But As a field right now, in terms of, if you define the field in terms of its publication venues, we are experiencing massive growth. All right, the main conferences have just gotten bigger and bigger and bigger, and that growth is not really driven by linguistics departments. All right, that growth is coming from people who are in computer science, and in particular working in machine learning or artificial intelligence, and interested in language as an application area for their machine learning. So we have this influx of people who are interested in language as a way to prove how good their machine learning algorithms are, and not necessarily interested in how language works, or even how to make the most effective NLP technology. Okay. And that might be a slightly cynical take on the field, but that's where I am right now. And I'd like to acknowledge that, so the big conferences are things like ACL and its chapter conferences, which are the North American chapter, the European chapter, and the new Asian chapter. It's very exciting. IJC NLP is also based in Asia. And EMNLP, which started off as a special interest group within ACL. There's also things like StarSem and so on. All of these big conferences have this property. There's two conferences that are quite different. One is COLING and the other is PACLIC. And COLING and PACLIC are really still meet points between linguistics and computational linguistics and NLP, and PACLIC even is between linguistics and computational linguistics. Okay, so what happens if you have people coming in and using language or linguistics as an application area without actually understanding the application area itself? Well, you get these overclaims. It is painful to read the machine learning papers on linguistics, on language sometimes, because you get things like, well, my AI learns X property about language just like a baby does. All right? Just like a baby does, because it is only exposed to the linguistic signal, and that's what they think babies do, right? Or maybe it's the linguistic signal plus some visual stimuli. But none of the social stuff, none of the interactional cues that human language learners actually have, all right? And these claims about what babies do never, ever, ever come with links into the child psychology literature, the child language acquisition literature. I should maybe not say never, ever, ever. There are people who are really interested in doing computational modeling of language acquisition, and those are not the people I'm talking about. It's the AI hype claims, where it comes as if there isn't a research field that looks into that stuff seriously, as if there isn't a literature that they should be responsible to. I claim that doing it this way also leads to less effective technology. And I have argued in print that having more linguistic knowledge rather than less can help us build better NLP, and in fact more language-independent NLP if you take the results of typology. And there's many papers showing recently how if you add some linguistic knowledge, you get better results. Chan et al. From this year is a recent example of that. But that's where we get to this difference in goals, all right? If you're interested in showing just how smart your machine learner is, then you don't want to hand it expert knowledge, because then you're proving less about what it can learn. If you're interested in building better language technology, then you want to give it everything it can so that it can actually work well, right? And this is segueing over to the main point for today, we get, nope, next slide is the main point for today. Okay, before the main point, so less effective technology, less effective evaluation of that technology, right? If you don't have domain experts, which in this case is linguists, in the loop who understand the shape of the problem, to be involved in designing the evaluation tasks, to be involved in error analysis, then you are really handicapping yourself if you want to try to understand why the system works as well as it does and how to improve it. So we are going to get less effective technology and less effective evaluation of that technology if we don't have linguists involved. We're also, and here's the main point, going to get less inclusive technology and a hampered understanding of the bias in that technology. So most work on NLP is on English only. But even if we just say, okay, let's focus on more languages, that's not enough, because we also need variation within languages represented. So we need the input not just from linguists working on lots of languages and typologists, but also sociolinguists if we want to build technology that's truly inclusive. I have more examples of that coming up. And if we want to understand the bias that is being developed into the technology, more examples of that coming too. we need to have people in the room who understand what's in the data that we're working with, right? There is, in a lot of work that uses text as data, and that's sort of a catchphrase in data science, a strong temptation to take what people say about the world as a reliable, ground truth, valid representation of the world. So I'd like you to think for just a moment of any kind of text where you think that might be a valid strategy. That if we're going to use machine reading to read a text and take what we've gotten out of that text as a representation of the world, where the text is not going to be biasing the machine. I don't have a good answer to that question, but what I have coming here are 3 case studies where it's not a good idea. All right, so here's case study number 1. Google image search. All right, how does image search work? As I understand it, the search engines have taken large collections of photos on the web and text next to those photos, right? And use the text effectively as naturally occurring labels of what's in the photo. So then you could type in your search string and you get back some collection of photos. And I'm sure there's a lot more learning on top of that to generalize from photos that have been labeled one way to other photos that look similar, and so on and so on. So this is a little bit old. This is 2016. And the tweet here says, I saw a tweet saying Google unprofessional hairstyles for work. I did. Then I checked the professional ones. Right? 3 sarcastic upside down smileys. So back in 2016, if you did this search, and I know that the search engines are a little bit location specific, it would be kind of fun to try that here, but if you tried it in the US, unprofessional hairstyles got pictures of very, very carefully styled African American hair, and professional got white women, okay? And there's an article here in The Guardian actually about this if you want to read more. It turns out that it's not that people posted these pictures of the African American women and said, these women look unprofessional. That's not the source here. The source is women in blog posts saying, this is how I looked today when I was told I looked unprofessional. But the search engine just saw unprofessional hairstyle, all right, and connected it to the picture because it was in the text. Now, to their credit, this was a big brouhaha, and now it's fixed. If you search, do the same search now, you get something that's this is the professional hairstyles, right? Not the unprofessional hairstyles. So better on the ethnicity front. There's still a problem though, which is it's not the case that only women have hair, right? So that's case study number 1. Case study number 2 involves word embeddings and these famous analogy problems. Right, so very briefly, a word embedding is a way of representing a word based on what else it co-occurs with in lots and lots and lots of text. Right? The predecessor of this was called vector space encodings. Now, when you see this phrase word embedding, it means that representation has been pulled out of a neural network that is probably trained to do something like a language modeling task. And the idea is that you represent words in terms of what other words they co-occur with, and then words that have similar meanings should have similar representations. The representations are vectors, long lists of numbers about what else it's come up near. That's the vector space version. And 2 words that mean similar things should occur in roughly the same context. Also, because you can do vector space math, you can say, well, if I take the vector for, what's my first example here? Take the vector for Paris, and I look at the transformation I have to do on it to get to France. And then I take the vector for Tokyo and I do that same thing, I get Japan, all right? So if you take word embeddings and you train them on English newswire text, you get these cool things, right? You can solve this analogy problem. You can do another one. Man is to king as woman is to queen. Yay, it worked. Why am I showing you this? Because it doesn't always work. So man is to computer programmer as woman is to homemaker. All right, that's pretty awful. What's happening? Well, the word embeddings are just picking up what's in the text, and what's in the text is not either a faithful representation of how the world is, nor a faithful representation of how we want the world to be. Okay? Now imagine that these word embeddings, these representations of word meanings, were included in a resume screening program. That could have pretty terrible effects, right? So this paper here, Bolak-Bassi et al. 2016, documented this bias and then came up with a way of debiasing specifically on the gender dimension, so that they get word embeddings that lose this association, that they lose associations with gender when it is not appropriate. So it's a good paper, I recommend it. It's case study number 2. All right. Case study number 3 also involves word embeddings, and this is some work by Robin Spear, and it looks at restaurant reviews. So one of the very famous tasks in NLP is sentiment analysis, and the idea there is you take some text and you have to decide, is this text, either the whole thing or parts of it, expressing positive evaluation, positive feelings and sentiment towards something neutral or negative, right? And sometimes you get more specific, like what's called aspect-based sentiment analysis, where if it's a restaurant review, are they positive about the ambiance but negative about the menu? Or positive about the service but negative about the price, and so on like that. So the task in this case is, given a restaurant review, predict the stars. So take this data off of Yelp or a similar service. This was Yelp in that case. And train on that data. So you've got a whole bunch of reviews with associated stars, 1 to 5, 5 being good. But then you can add other components into the system to give it more knowledge to work with. And here what Robin Spear does is she takes the web-trained word embeddings and a sentiment lexicon. And so there's a representation for all of the words that have to do not just with how they're used in the restaurant reviews, but how they're used in text on the web at large in English. And the sentiment lexicon is a collection of words already listed as positive, negative, or neutral. And so the trick is basically to say, okay, a word that in its embedding looks like a positive sentiment word is probably positive itself, and similarly for the negative ones. So what was the result? It was a sentiment analysis system that systematically underpredicts the stars for Mexican restaurants. Okay? Why? So underpredicts the stars means that here's a person who really liked a Mexican restaurant, they describe it, they give it 5 stars, but the system says, oh, that's probably only a 3-star review. Well, the why is in the web-trained word embeddings. So these representations of words, used to decide if they were positive or negative words, were trained on all of the garbage that is out there on the web, right? Including the garbage that is in American political discourse right now about people from Mexico, where our politicians, among others, are saying reprehensible things enough of the time that the word Mexican itself was coming up as a negative sentiment word. So you've got someone giving a positive review of a Mexican restaurant, but because they use the word Mexican in the review, the system says, oh, well, that's clearly a negative word. They're not enjoying this restaurant, right? So this is, I think, a very clear case of how we don't want to take any of the body of text that is the web, as a sort of worst case, as an accurate and faithful representation of the world as it is, or as we want it to be. I have one more case study for you. It's a slightly different kind of thing. But it's another kind of problem that comes up if we don't understand what's going on in technology when we use it. So this is a story from 2017, about a year ago, when it happened in Israel. A Palestinian man posted a picture on Facebook where he was posing next to a bulldozer, and he captioned it, "Good morning," in Arabic, presumably Palestinian Arabic. And Facebook's translator translated that as 2 options. If you looked in English, it said hurt them, and if you looked in Hebrew, it said attack them. Neither of which were accurate, all right? Well, the Israeli police were alerted to this post for some reason and went and arrested the poor guy on the basis of this Facebook post. Now, the story has a non-terrible ending in that I think the man was in custody for only about a day, all right? But that shouldn't have happened at all, right? And it presumably wouldn't have happened if the Israeli police had actually asked someone to look at the original Arabic, a person who speaks the variety, and to tell them, no, it doesn't mean hurt them or attack them. So here's the link for that if you're interested in reading more about it. One of the things that I think this really shows is that as we build technology that is in the hands of the public in general, including people who have power over other people, we have a responsibility to build it in such a way so that its shortcomings are clear. And something that I think would be a very interesting project, which maybe I'll find someone who wants to work on with me, is how to design into the interface the information that a linguist brings to working with machine translation output. Right? So if you're working with a machine translation system, and it's giving you output that's really disfluent in the language you're looking at, then you know it's probably pretty bad. But it can give you language that's fluent. The output can look very grammatical and still be an inaccurate translation. And I think as linguists, when we interact with these things, we usually have a better idea than the average person about that. Right? Just like linguists have a better idea than the average person about how to use a dictionary when you're doing translation yourself. Right? We understand something about synonyms and the distribution of word senses and how that's not the same across languages. And so the design project that I would like to see happen is figuring out how to take that knowledge and make it visible to non-linguists in the interface. Right? It's not enough to put some disclaimer in fine print that you have to click agree on before you can use the translation. Right? 'Cause nobody reads those. So it has to be something in the interface that shows people the uncertainty. And one example that I like about that is Microsoft's Skype translator does speech-to-speech translation, but it does it through text. Right? And if you watch it while it's working, it actually prints for the first step, where you're doing speech-to-text. It prints what it thinks you're saying, and you can see it updating. So it edits as it goes. And it's a little bit jarring to watch at first, but then I realized it's actually great because it shows the uncertainty that the machine has. You see the machine correcting itself and changing things. That is a nice cue that it might still be wrong. And so something like that, I think, is going to be the trick to showing people this stuff might be wrong. And the better it gets, the more important it is to leave that cue in there that it might be wrong. All right, so one of the hard things about giving this kind of talk is I've now told you everything's terrible. All right, this technology we're building, it's hurting people, it's causing harm in the world. So what can we do about it? Well, I have a bunch of suggestions, starting with more truly interdisciplinary collaboration. We need the humanists in the room as technology is being designed, as the evaluation of technology is being designed, all through the process, right? I think it's also helpful to make linguistics more accessible to people whose training is primarily in computer science, if only because that alerts people to the size and shape of the problem and would prime them to then come talk to more linguists. So I've been working on that. I've done some tutorials, I've written a couple of books. But what I'm going to talk about today are these last points. So one is incorporating training on ethics in the curriculum. So I'm going to talk some about what I've done about that. And then the other thing is to create and promote practices that bring properties of the data into focus to the people building the technology and to the people using the technology built on that data. And so I have a particular suggestion, and this is the work of Blatche Friedman, called data statements along those lines. But none of this is a panacea, right? There's always going to be more to do, and I'm always interested in more ideas. All right, so all of that was overview and motivations. Now I'm going to talk about teaching ethics in NLP before getting into data statements. This is the course syllabus for the class I'm going to talk about. It is ugly artisanal HTML, not high production values, but I am a strong believer in putting this kind of course material out on the web so that other people who are teaching similar courses can build on these ideas. So that'll stay up so long as I have that website. And I should say a little bit of the history of that class. A very wise member of the advisory board for our master's program several years ago now said, you all should be talking about ethics. And I said, okay, ethics. And I went looking around for someone who could come into our program and give us a talk, or some class I could tell the students to go take, or something someone could do to bring ethics into our program, and couldn't find anything. We actually do have some wonderful researchers on campus in the tech policy lab, who I have connected with now, but when I tried reaching out to them then and they didn't know me, they weren't interested. So tried for a year or two and failed, and I finally said, okay, well, I guess I'm the one to teach this class. So I decided to put my graduate seminar on that topic. This is in the 2016-2017 academic year. And spent about 6 months just collecting everything I could find that seemed relevant, and came up with a reading list that was way too long. And so we, as a group, basically attacked that reading list by different students reading different things and then discussing it together in class. And I should say that I didn't read all of it. Like the students, I read a couple each week and led the discussion. So So the questions that I brought into this class were, what problems have occurred with language technology or might occur in the future? What frameworks are available for analyzing those problems in ethical terms? Because I know that ethics is a long-standing area of research in philosophy, and we don't need to recreate that. We can go learn from the philosophers. What best practices are out there for mitigating such problems? And how do we engage the field at large in these discussions? And this is really starting to happen. There's now been 2 workshops in ethics and NLP, and there's an ongoing series that used to be called FAT-ML and now is FAT-STAR, which is fairness, accountability, and transparency. But when I was planning this class, it was still, seems like people didn't want to talk about it. So the question is, how do we get the field engaged? All right, so I'm just going to bring you through this class week by week and talk about what we did as an example for how to approach this. So this is in the context of a graduate class. It was an elective. The people who were interested in doing it were there, and there was no one who was there because they had to be. Right? So for the first week, it was about framing things and getting started. And we discussed the paper by Screwitt and Hobie from ACL 2016, where they call for a discussion of ethics and NLP, and they introduced 5 key concepts. The first is exclusion. If you leave groups of people, i.e. most of the world, out of the training data, you're going to get technology that doesn't work for most of the world. Overgeneralization is the problem where you get false positives. So if your system isn't trained on a sufficiently representative set of data, it can give incorrect answers that then go on to cause harm. Overexposure is a different problem where if you get too much attention focused on certain things, then humans can take that and run with it the wrong direction. So if you get a lot of papers talking about how XYZ variety is hard to process, and that would be not because the variety is inherently hard, but because it's too different from the other varieties that the system was trained on. Humans might read that and say, oh, that's a hard, problematic variety, rather than there's something wrong with the technology. Underexposure is this problem that most resources are focused on a very few languages. And then there's the problem of dual use. Anytime you build something, it's probably got a harmful way that it could be used. Right? So just for example, if you were building a system to detect fake reviews, someone could immediately turn that around and use it to create harder to detect fake reviews. All right. We also talked some about what the obstacles are to more ethical practice in NLP. And one thing that we noted is there's this, at least in the American context, mavericky culture in computer science, especially startups. This, move fast and break things ethos from Facebook, or it's all about disrupting markets and doing things quickly. And that doesn't really leave space for the kind of thoughtful reflection required to figure out who's going to be impacted by this, and how can I make sure that those impacts are positive? There's also, if you're looking in NLP more broadly and not just the academy, there's no single avenue for enforcement. There's no institutional review board that a startup has to submit their ideas to. Right? And computational linguists generally don't do IRB approval anyway. They probably should. We think we're exempt because we're not talking to people directly, we're just taking their tweets or something. And then there's this problem of getting buy-in from people. And I think this is improving, or maybe I'm just talking to different people, but in late 2018 compared to early 2017, it feels like the conversation is different. But early on, I would get things from people saying, well, we don't have to study ethics, it's just common sense, right? Or alternatively, well, bottom line considerations, I'm in a startup, I have to make money, that doesn't leave me the time or resources to worry about that. These two things are kind of and neither of them is a good reason not to engage with this. So what we came to in the seminar was we can't make people do things, although the people working on how to make people do things are really quite interesting, and that's the lawyers and others in the tech policy lab thinking about what are the policy proposals we should make to government agencies that could actually put a legal framework in place. And so I'm glad there's people thinking about that. Those of us who are just looking at it from an NLP perspective said, well, what we can do is we can lead by example, and we can try to initiate broad, active discussions. So what I've got for most of these weeks is if you read just one thing, so that the web page from the class has all the links to all of the papers, and some of them are academic papers and some of them are blog posts like this one. So this is my recommendation from week 1 is The Code I'm Still Ashamed Of from medium.com. It's actually not about NLP specifically, but a really interesting piece to read about the responsibility of programmers. All right, then we spent 2 weeks on philosophical underpinnings because I knew that there's a whole bunch of work out there on ethics. You could probably write a whole PhD on ethics, in fact, I'm sure people do. Obviously, we weren't going to cover all of that, but this is where, again, I took the divide and share approach, where I had everyone in the class read 2 articles on ethics, and I really wanted to avoid the trap of saying, okay, so there's the real philosophy, that is the philosophy of the Western tradition starting with the Greeks, and then there's the other philosophies. And setting up, I didn't want to set up that kind of a dialogue. And so instead what I said is, everyone go read 2 of these things, and be sure to pick at least one that's coming from a social address very different from your own. Go make sure that at least one of the perspectives on ethics is coming from someone whose social background is very, very different. And then I asked the students to bring 4 questions to their readings. 1, what is the main thesis? What is the definition of ethics in that reading? In what ways is that definition contrasted with the definitions of others? And how does it relate to ethics and NLP? And then we, over 2 weeks, basically had everyone answering these questions for their readings. And that gave us various systems for thinking about what constitutes ethical behavior or ethical systems. And there was an interesting, unexpected benefit of this divide and share approach that I just want to share for anyone who's an educator in the room. On the student evaluations at the end of the quarter, one of the students pointed out that this made them far more comfortable asking questions in class because no one was expected to have read everything. And so you weren't revealing ignorance or revealing that you hadn't done your homework by asking a question about a paper that someone else had read. I thought, that's brilliant. I better remember that for the future. So if you read just one thing, this is my recommendation from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Social Networking and Ethics was a really interesting piece. All right, so then we got into weeks where basically I had taken all of these resources that I found and tried to bunch them up by topic. So week 4 was on exclusion and discrimination and bias. And my recommendation here is this paper by Latanya Sweeney in ACM, that is Communications of the ACM. So this is like the monthly magazine that goes to all ACM members, ACM being the Association for Computing Machinery. And this is a story of discrimination in online ad delivery. So she's a professor of computer science, and she was in a colleague's office and searched her own name to find a paper that she had written to share with her colleague. And the ad that came up in the sidebar says, has Latanya Sweeney committed a crime? Or something to that effect. She's like, wait, what? All right. And so she started doing a search, and what she found was a very, very carefully controlled study. She came up with a list of names that sounded African American and a list of names that sounded not African American, I think specifically white, actually. And none of these names corresponded to people who were in any lists of people who had actually committed crimes. Okay? So it was just what did the names sound like. And then she tried searching for those names in both Google and other places where Google was serving up ads. And what she found was this company that was advertising background checks had 2 different versions, or 2 different types of versions for their ad. One was, get more information about so-and-so, and the other one was, has so-and-so ever committed a crime? And as you can probably guess from how I'm telling the story, there was a significant correlation between the perceived race of the name and which of those options came up. And this, again, has real-world consequences. Imagine that someone with an African-American sounding name, like Dr. Sweeney herself, is applying for a job, and members of the search committee search for her to find her webpage and see that ad coming up. Right? Even if they don't click on it, that little subliminal message says, this person may have a criminal history, right? Which is really, really bad. So she's careful not to speculate about the particular causes about this in the article. The article is laying out the careful methodology and showing the problem. But one possibility is that this is the result of the money in the system optimizing on the clicks. So the way that Google gets paid is by how many times someone actually clicks on an ad. And so they are incentivized to serve up the ads that are most likely to get clicks. And then the other factor there is how much is the advertiser paying them to. And what's happened is because of the behavior of the crowd, who were more interested in clicking the link if it was an African-American sounding name together with committed a crime, and more interested in clicking the link if it was a white sounding name with just background info, that basically trained the system, possibly, it's a speculation, into this state. So you can get these kinds of consequences without anybody directly trying to be a bad actor. Okay, week 5, we squeezed 2 topics in. One was this problem that I was talking about before, about taking word embeddings and other kinds of language behavior as ground truth. And like I've mentioned before, much work in NLP assumes that large text collections are a really good way of getting information about the world, but those text collections reflect biases, including both what people choose to talk about and what they choose to say about what they're talking about, given their own biased perspectives. So if you read just one thing, I recommend that Overgeneralization et al. Paper I was talking about before, but there's lots of fun stuff to read here, really interesting and engrossing work. So this one, the Overgeneralization et al. Paper, is actually looking at distributional semantics as a way to study questions of philosophy. So this is taking the bug that Overgeneralization et al. Are talking about and turning it into a feature because it's useful for that kind of particular research. And then this last link here is the blog post that the Mexican restaurant sentiment analysis story comes from by Robin Spear. So you can tell that this is the part that I was most excited about, but the students were also excited about other things, and so in that we squeezed in the question of chatbots. Right? And this is a different kind of ethical issue that comes up when we have an inanimate object in the world, right? But we ascribe human properties to it, including gender, and then we treat it as an inanimate object. What does that do to our notions of gender and how we behave towards each other? And there's, I think, a lot that's problematic about making all of the chatbots female. And I resist this. I try my best. We have all the different kinds of spy bots in our house. Right? We have Alexa, we have Google Home, and we have, and I don't use Siri, but I have Apple devices, right? Okay, I don't have Cortana. Nobody uses Cortana as far as I know. At any rate, I insist on calling them all it, even though they speak to me largely in female-sounding voices. But if you read things about it, people will often talk about Alexa as she and her. So if you read just one thing from this, there's a very nice blog post on Medium about the user experience design choice of calling Google Home or the Google Assistant just Google, so you wake it up by saying, okay, Google, versus Amazon's Alexa, that you wake by saying Alexa. An interesting article. All right, for week 6, we went through a proposed code of ethics for NLP that had Domain III proposed, with the questions, what's missing and why, which points shouldn't be there and why. Should the Association for Computational Linguistics, that is our professional body, actually adopt a code of ethics of this sort, and why or why not? As I understand it, the current state of that is there are some proposals floating around, but nothing formalized. And my strong feeling is that for this to be effective, it has to be bottom-up with lots of buy-in from the community, because the leadership of the organization can make the code and print it, but if people aren't engaged with it, it's not going to do anything. And then I had students thinking about cases that seem to contradict one or more of the points in the code that are nonetheless ethical. So sort of a discussion was there. All right. We're still down in the everything's terrible, aren't we? What can we do about it? This is now where we're turning to how can we actually make things better? And this is where I found value-sensitive design, which is a long-standing research program of Batya Friedman and her colleagues, and she came and gave a guest lecture for us. Value-sensitive design is a set of practices to identify and integrate the values of stakeholders in the design process. So it is a sense of basically a theory and practice of how to go about doing better, with the wonderful attribute that it's about better, not best. Because it's really easy when you're looking at how terrible things are, and when you know, as we all do, feel ourselves to be good people who don't want to hurt other people, to just say, oh, it's all impossible, I better do nothing, right? Value-sensitive design says, we're going to keep building technology, and our responsibility is better, not best. Progress, not perfection. Value-sensitive design asks us to identify both direct and indirect stakeholders, and I have some definitions of that coming up in the third part of the talk. And then work with them to understand their values, and then do further work to make sure that those values are represented. So stakeholder interviews helps in identifying values. Design noir is the strategy of basically storytelling to figure out what could go wrong, and then figuring out how to mitigate that. And then they have a wonderful thing called Envisioning Cards, which is basically a deck of cards that you can use as you're working on something, and it reminds you to think about various kinds of populations, various kinds of situations that you might not think of when you are busy trying to sell the technology to your investors. So the Envisioning Cards ask you questions like, how does this affect the elderly? How does this affect young children? How does this affect recent immigrant populations? What happens if everybody's using this? And so on. So one fun and short paper to read from this is this one by Nathan et al. On value scenarios, which is this design noir concept of the practice of coming up with these stories of what could go wrong. And I have some examples later. All right, I found some writing about other best practices. Week 9, we got into the issue of privacy. And this is something that you could spend a whole class on, right? Privacy is a really important aspect of all of this. So Michael Struve in Germany teaches a whole class on it called The Dark Side of NLP. And again, coming from the perspective of what can we do about this, and what do I and people like me who work on this technology have as a particular obligation because of our expertise. And this is what came up is, what part of our obligation is informing the public about how NLP and massive online presentation of self impinges on privacy. So many people, I think, still believe, oh, nobody cares about me. How's anybody going to find my posts? Right? But they don't understand, even though they use Google themselves, just how effective search technology can be. And I wonder, that might be somewhat culturally specific. I know there's a lot of wonderful things that happen in mainland China around circumlocutions online to get around censorship, and those same ideas could probably also get around search. So this notion of people not understanding this if they're not the developers of technology might be less true in China, I don't know. But I think there's some work to be done in terms of science communication around reaching out to the public and informing them what it means if you put stuff online. This is my recommendation for the paper from that one. I've got nothing to hide and other misunderstandings of privacy. It's in a law journal, but it was actually quite approachable and a really interesting paper. All right. So finally, we looked at places where people were using NLP to actually address ethical issues. So NLP for social good. And what I asked the students to do when they were reading this week was to summarize what the social issue was that was addressed, talk about how well did it work, or if there wasn't an evaluation, talk about how it could be evaluated, and then to do some design noir and ask themselves what could go wrong. So this was a really fun class, and I learned an awful lot. I think the students learned a lot. It is not the only way, or even a complete solution for bringing ethics into our curriculum. And so now that I've done this, I have the problem of, okay, well, how do I integrate this into the classes that everyone does have to take? Make sure that everyone's actually engaging with it, not just those who take one of their electives and put it into ethics. Sorry, this is a long talk. Thank you for sticking with me. It's a long talk, and we're on to the final part of it, which is the data statements proposal. So this is a proposed professional practice to give people something that they can do better, not best. Make sure we don't spill that. All right. So this talk is sort of a sub-talk. It's got its own outline. Here's the nutshell. The nutshell is that the data sets we work with in NLP come from people. The speakers, the annotators, and the curators. And I'll talk about all those separately. Those people aren't representative of the full populations that our technology impacts. And that mismatch can lead to real-world harms. So our practical suggestion is this notion of data statements that make the people visible. And we anticipate that this will lead to both better science and more ethical practice. Right? It is not a zero-sum game. We can do better science and be more ethical at the same time. The trade-off is time. This stuff takes more time. And that's okay. I think it's okay to slow down and do things more methodically and more carefully. And I realize that I'm pushing back against the whole financial structure of things by saying that. But just because they've got the money doesn't mean they're right. Okay, so I'm going to do some definitions, talk about why NLP needs data statements, and then get into the details. All right, so what's a data set? A data set is a collection of linguistic behavior. That could be speech, it could be writing, it could be videoed linguistic production together with gesture, it could be signed language, of course, and data sets often come with annotations. Right? The speaker, the individual who produced some segment of linguistic behavior included in the data set, even if it's written, we're linguists, we're going to call them speakers. The annotators are the people who assign annotations to the raw data, and we get both crowd workers and highly trained annotators in NLP. And people often forget, but transcription is the first layer of annotation. So if the language started off spoken, then the first kind of annotation is actually writing it down. The curators are the people who select which data to include. In a spoken corpus, that might be someone actually constructing the situation, the person who's decided to make the math task, for example, is behaving as a curator. Or it might be the person who decides, well, I'm going to take these many articles from the Wall Street Journal in 1989 because I think the Wall Street Journal is interesting for some reason and because it was the one thing that was digitized at that point. All right, so those decisions are made by curators. And then stakeholders are the people who are either directly or indirectly impacted by the system. So a direct stakeholder is someone who actually uses the software, and an indirect stakeholder is someone whose life is impacted by someone else's use of the software. So in the online ad delivery example, Professor Sweeney was an indirect stakeholder when someone else did a search and saw her name. All right, I'm going to use algorithm for both rule-based and machine learning approaches to NLP, and NLP system for a piece of software that does some kind of natural language processing, and that's typically going to involve an algorithm trained on some specific data set. And then bias, and when I'm talking to a computer science audience, this is really important. We're not talking about the bias that a learner uses to learn things, but rather computer systems that systematically and unfairly discriminate against certain individuals or groups of individuals in favor of others. So it has to be systematic and unfair, and that's different from the technical machine learning notion of bias. All right, so why do we need these data statements? Well, the whole first half of this talk should have motivated that. But another way of talking about it is to say that systems that are trained on naturally occurring text are going to learn the biases held by the speakers of that text. That's pre-existing bias. And there we get these examples of the word embeddings picking up gender, the Mexican restaurant example. And there's also evidence that machine learning systems not only absorb that bias, but make it worse. They amplify the biases that they encounter in the data. And then there's emergent bias, where systems are trained on one subpopulation and don't work as well on others. And there's evidence showing that part-of-speech tagging and ASR, speech recognition, don't work well across varieties. You train something on one person's variety of English and then you test it on someone else's, and it's not going to work as well unless it's a very similar variety. So there's two types of things we might be doing in NLP, or maybe this is computational linguistics in NLP. So sometimes we're building software to learn patterns in language as language. And sometimes we are trying to learn knowledge about the world from what people have said in language. And both of these things happen in NLP. And we would like to have data sets that represent the full population and have been fully debiased, okay? But that's never actually going to be achieved. And so the question is, how do we mitigate the negative effects of the persistent bias? What are some strategies we can use? So the idea with data statements is we want to foreground characteristics of our data sets so that users of the system and also the developers as they're working on it keep in mind who is represented and who is not represented. And that will then support reasoning about what the possible mismatches may be and allow us to recognize limitations of both training and test data. So the limitations in the training data are if you train something on a certain data set, that's going to limit how it can be effectively deployed. Limitations in the test data are limitations in how far you can generalize your results. Right? Test data in NLP is supposed to show, hey, my system can generalize beyond what it was trained on. But if we aren't clear about what that test data is, we're not clear about just how far it generalizes. All right, so in NLP, papers that present new data sets usually have pretty careful discussion of the annotation process and a very brief, if any, characterization of the language and genre of language. But papers that present experiments have a briefer characterization of the annotations and often leave out mention of genre and even language. So just to substantiate that last point, there were 98 regular papers in EACL 2009, and 33 of them did not name the language studied. 81% of the ACL 2015 papers didn't name the language studied. What language do you suppose that was? It was English. Of course it was English. Those of you who saw my previous talk saw this tweet already. Natural language is not a synonym for English. Right? Okay. So that's the baseline that I'm starting from. I'm starting from a field that can't even be bothered to say which language it's working on, let alone which variety of that language or anything else about the speakers whose data they're working from. Right? So it's very rare to find careful characterization of either speakers or annotators, although we will usually know if the annotators were experts or crowd workers. A really notable exception is this work by Duchinsky et al. In 2016, where they sampled a corpus of tweets from diverse communities, and then they were interested in named entity recognition, so finding the people and organizations and products and whatnot. And they had crowd workers from those same communities that the tweets came from doing that annotation. Because if you're not in the community, you are probably not going to understand all the named entities. So that's a nice exception to this general rule. All right, so one of the things we learn about in value-sensitive design is value tension. When you've identified values that you want to respect, they are often in competition with each other. So here's one in this context where there's some competition. We want NLP data statements included in all NLP papers and all NLP system documentation. And this includes what I like to call the NLP engineering experiment papers. And these NLP data statements should be detailed, but we have these page limits. Right? You have to fit your engineering experiment description into 8 pages or 9 pages. And so people aren't going to do a long, detailed description of the data set. So our solution to this value tension is to have both long and short form data statements so that the information is there, but it's not taking up too much space. A second value tension is a little bit harder. As a reader of an NLP paper or a consumer who's using a product trained on this kind of data set, I want as much information as possible in order to best judge how the system's going to generalize. Is it appropriate for my case? But the people whose information we are describing are people, right? And they have privacy concerns, especially if it's a very small identifiable group. So I don't have a general purpose, let's just do long versus short type answer here, but rather just to urge each project to find the right balance, and also to plan ahead. So when you're collecting data, if you think about the kind of information you're going to want to put in your data statement, then you can ask speakers A, for that information, and B, for permission to include it. And that can make it easier down the line. All right, so what is a data statement? Having built it up. Basically, it's a set of information, and we have these proposed headings to include to describe the data. And I will go through them all in detail, or no, not in detail, briefly. So the first thing is the curation rationale. Which texts, and I'm using text to include spoken text, were included, and what were the goals in selecting the texts, both in the original collection and in any further sub-selection. That is, when you were collecting this stuff, how did you pick what to include and why? Right, and I have a note to myself here to say that this is especially important in data sets that are too big to go through by hand. Right? If you could always sort of open it up and look a little bit, but you don't know what you're seeing is representative unless the person who collected the data can go in and say, this is why we collected it. All right. The next one, and this used to be the first one until we realized that the curation rationale was really important, is language variety. Right? Languages, I'm talking to linguists here, right, differ from each other in structural but bounded ways that can affect NLP performance. This is what typology teaches us. And within a language, regional and social dialects can also show great variation. And so we want to know which variety we're working on. So that could look like this. We recommend that people give us the BCP47 language tag, which is actually a standard for expressing this. And I'm pleased to say that this UA Hunt HK example has been in these slides since I started presenting this work. Didn't know that I was going to be talking about it in Hong Kong, but I wanted to give two examples. So the idea is you give the tag and then a prose description. So the tag might be less specific than the prose description. So ENUS is, in my example, English as spoken in Palo Alto, California in the USA. So that is more specific than ENUS in general. And then this UA Hunt HK is Cantonese written with traditional characters by speakers in Hong Kong who are bilingual in Mandarin. Is more information than is in that tag. But it's good to have the tags because that is very interoperable across lots of systems, and good to have the full description. All right, speaker demographic. We know from sociolinguistics dating back decades that you get variation in pronunciation, prosody, word choice, grammatical structure, lexical choice, I said that word choice, according to speaker demographic characteristics. And this is not that old people talk like this or women talk like that. It's that as people construct and project their identity, they are making use of this linguistic variation that is associated with different groups. So that's going to lead to some differences. We also know that transfer from L1 can affect the language produced by L2 speakers. And you also get variation based on disordered speech, so the dysarthria that we were hearing about in Professor Munn's talk at PACLIC. So, a nice complete data statement will include information about speaker demographic along all of these lines. And it'd be good to also know the number of different speakers represented. Fairly obvious to linguists that we want to know the demographic information about the speakers. We also need demographic information about the annotators, because annotators are also involved in linguistic performance, right? As they listen or read and add information. And their own experience with language, which is going to be influenced by their own social address, is going to, in turn, influence how they do that annotation work. And so here we have an example that Dzerzhinsky et al. 2016 paper again, where they found that the recognition of named entities depends on local community-specific knowledge. And so we want to know who the annotators are. So similarly, we want to know age, gender, race, ethnicity, native language, socioeconomic status, and training in linguistics or any other relevant discipline for the annotators. All right, speech situation. Also well known that characteristics of the speech situation can affect linguistic structure and patterns at many levels. You might not be able to tell, but I am trying to speak slowly, which is not something I usually do in everyday conversation. In general, people speak differently to close friends versus strangers, to small versus large groups, children versus adults, people versus machines, and Laurent had really interesting data on that point about how people process differently when they're talking to machines too. That's really intriguing. So the time and place provide a broader context for understanding how the text collected relate to the historical moment. So for all these reasons, we want to know about the speech situation, and for that we suggest specifying time and place, modality, is it spoken or signed versus written, is it scripted or edited versus spontaneous, is the interaction synchronous or asynchronous, so are we talking about face-to-face conversation or text chats, are we talking about Twitter, which is kind of somewhere in between, are we talking about letters that go back and forth, and then who's the intended audience? Who does the person producing the language think they're talking to, right? I think, so I think I'm talking to you, and I also know that I'm talking to whoever's watching that video. And that's also affecting my production to the extent that I'm staying focused on it. All right, text characteristics. What are the genre and topic of the text? From Biber and others, we know that those are going to influence the vocabulary as well as structural things that are represented. And again, this affects how well the systems trained on such data can generalize. If we're working with audio and visual recordings, it's good to know about the recording quality. We have an other in here because we don't claim to have solved this problem entirely, and as people start using data statements, we expect that there might be other kinds of information that people find useful. And so we want there to be room to grow, but also the idea that even once things have really become stabilized and standardized, there may still be information that's specific to a data set that doesn't fall into the other categories, and we don't want to prevent people from exposing that information. And then finally, there's the Provenance Appendix. So very often, data sets are derived from other data sets, and so the full data statements for source data sets should be included as an appendix in the new data statement. And that doesn't mean that the new one doesn't get a full data statement, but just that we have to keep the full trail in there. All right, so that's the long form, and you can imagine why you wouldn't want that showing up in every single research paper. So we also have the short form, and the idea there is a 60 to 100 word summary of the long form one that hits the main points, and critically includes a pointer to where the long form can be found. So that long form should go with maybe the paper that presents the data set originally, a project web page, or a system documentation is where you can find the long form, and then the short form has the pointer to it. All right. So I imagine my NLP audience saying, well, that's going to get repetitive. Do we really want to include an NLP data statement in every paper? Really? Even for things like the Penn tree bank that are familiar to everyone? And to that I say, yes. All right? I say yes because we should always consider how the data set fits the current study. And we should always consider how the results of the current study do and don't generalize. And if we don't make the data visible in this way, then it's harder to do those things. Let's see. I have some sample data statements in here. I think I'm going to skip over that. My point in putting them in was that just to make it concrete, what does it look like when we do this? And so I will do this very briefly for just one of them. This is the Penn Tree Bank, which is a collection of Wall Street Journal. What's this? Okay. This particular version of these slides comes from the initial submitted version of the paper where we had the curation rationale at the end. Just FYI, that's why it starts with language variety. But the curation rationale is actually the most interesting thing. So at the point that I wrote this data statement, which was very much post hoc, curation rationale was unknown, but we noted that the project acknowledged funding from DARPA, AFSOR, and Linguistic Data Consortium, and General Electric Corporation, which maybe tells you something about the curation rationale. These things are much harder to do post hoc than they are in the process of creating a data set. So for the Penn Tree Bank, we were able to find some stuff, but not everything. And then there's a shorter version. We also did a data statement for a newer data set. This is a project that is not initially conceived of as something for computational linguistics, but it seems like a data set that computational linguists might be interested in. And it's my co-author, Batya Friedman's project called Voices from the Rwanda Tribunal. And I'm going to take you to the curation rationale. The project is funded by the U.S. National Science Foundation as part of a larger research program focused on developing multi-lifespan design knowledge. Let's see. Basically, this was interviews with various people involved in the International Criminal Tribunal in Rwanda, so that they could tell their story to the Rwandan public and the world at large now, but also a long time from now. Where's the... Yeah. A couple more. So basically interviews where they could share with people of Rwanda, the international justice community, and the global public now, 50 and 100 years from now. So there's a really interesting intended audience. It's also linguistically very interesting. The interviews are mostly in English. and there's 5 that are in French and English, but it's world Englishes. And so I think it's a really interesting data set for, say, speech recognition on different varieties of English. So this is meant to show you that it's possible to write a data statement and you can get a lot of really rich information about what's in a data set and how you might find it exciting to use based on these kinds of descriptions. Okay, so I promised some details on value scenarios. Value scenarios, to remind you, is a technique from value-sensitive design, and it's a way of asking and exploring what would happen if the technology comes into widespread use over long periods of time. And so we did value scenarios, one for a particular NLP system, and also because we are proposing a technology, in a very broad sense of technology that is of data statements, we ran this process ourselves and said, what could happen with the data statements themselves? What influence might they have if they're adopted and go into widespread use? Okay, so the first one is actually inspired by a paper that appeared in one of the ACL conferences. And they were using a sort of a shorter version of this kind of value scenario to motivate doing better language ID, I think. And they're saying, why would you want better language ID? So they said, look, imagine you've got a system that uses social media data to predict what kinds of diseases are frequent in a community based on what people are tweeting about, and then send that information over to the healthcare practitioners so they know what to test for. And they roll it out. So this is now a value scenario, right? This thing hasn't been built. This is we're imagining what could happen. So let's say the software comes from a public university in the American Upper Midwest, and they work together with the hospital in their community, and this thing works really well. So they make it open source, they put it out there in the world, and a hospital in Nigeria wants to pick it up. And so they help them get it set up in Nigeria, and it fails. And in particular, what happens is that they're getting bad information. The diseases that the system is picking up are in fact not the ones that are prominent in the community, and so the doctors are ordering the wrong tests, and it's harming the trust that the community has in the hospital, and things go wrong. So what happens? Well, they, in this fictional scenario, go back to the open source developers and work with them to discover what happened was the very first step in this system is to do language ID on tweets, to find the ones that they should be paying attention to, find the ones that they can process. And because the tweets that are coming out in Nigeria don't represent the same variety of English as what was used in the upper Midwest of the United States, the system was basically throwing out all the tweets it should be looking at, because this language ID component was not trained with the local relevant data. So what could data statements do about this? Well, we know that in our fictional scenario, the open source documentation lacked critical information about this particular component that would have helped help people do successful localization. And so if we have NLP data statements for all the components, then there could have been proactive collaboration to address mismatch. And I looked at the data statements and said, wait a minute, we need to make a local version of this data sets of tweets that drive the language ID system so that we find the right tweets, and then this wouldn't have happened. That was value scenario number one. Value scenario number two is the positive rosy, so not design noir, value scenario around what would happen. This is the let's sell the data statements value scenario. Okay, so we're looking ahead to 2022, and at this point, data statement is now a standard heading in ACL papers, and we have less egregious mismatch between training and deployment because people are paying attention to what their data sets are. And the ACL members notice that there's still this problem of underexposure. Lots and lots of varieties are not actually included in what we can work on, and this becomes very visible because all of the papers are talking about the data statements, and it's always US English for the most part. Right? And so ACL members push for more representative data catalog, and national funding bodies get on board and jointly fund a project to discover gaps, which turns up many underserved communities, and the result of that is spur development of additional language resources that result in a more inclusive data catalog. So that is the positive scenario. So it's in fact already been recognized that many speaker populations are underrepresented and underserved. And we think that widespread uptake of NLP data statements can document this more precisely and help identify where the gaps are, and then this knowledge can be used to empower our community to broaden the catalog. So that was the positive scenario, but like I said, we have to also think about what could go wrong. So here's what could go wrong. So 2026, everyone's using these, so the ACL exec says, in fact, this is standardized and required. You can no longer, it's like you can't publish at the ACL without doing evaluation. Now, in my fictional scenario in 2026, you can't publish without giving us a data statement. Those standards are adopted in 2028, and there's an abrupt decline in papers from underrepresented regions at ACL conferences, and a decline in papers that give new data sets. A survey of researchers shows that the underrepresented institutions lack expertise in producing data statements, and it's way easier to copy-paste existing data statements than to make a new one, so people just reuse data. So these are some unintended consequences that we came up with. So, why did I do that little design noir? Because envisioning potential negative impacts helps mitigate them. And what we see from this is that NLP data statements should be widely used before any standardization takes place. We don't want to preemptively or prematurely say you must do this and not have it in a way that works for the community. And also, as soon as the community develops expertise, there should be mentoring put in place proactively to help people learn how to do this so that it is not restricted to the high resource institutions. All right, so my colleague Batya Friedman is one of the directors of the Tech Policy Lab. And so one of the exciting things about working with her was seeing how these kinds of ideas can actually lead to tech policy proposals and implications. All right, so we say that transparency of data sets and systems is essential for preserving accountability and building more just systems. And I should say at this juncture, there's actually several other groups who were independently coming up with similar proposals, not around NLP data sets, but around other kinds of AI, and references to those are in our paper. So as systems are being built, data statements enable developers and researchers to make informed choices about training sets and to flag potential underrepresented populations who may be overlooked or treated unfairly. As systems are deployed, the data statements are going to help in the diagnosis of systemic unfairness when it's detected in system performance. And at a societal level, that kind of transparency is really important for government and advocacy groups seeking to ensure protections. Putting this information out there doesn't itself solve anything, but it puts us in a position to do better on all of these fronts. So, if these things turn out to be useful as predicted, we see two implications for tech policy. We think that it should be a policy in academia, industry, and government that long-form data statements be required as a part of system documentation. It might be, for example, a requirement for ISO and other certification. And even groups that are creating data sets that they don't share, for example, the National Security Agency or IARPA, which is like DARPA but for the intelligence agencies, those are both US agencies, would be well advised to make internal data sets for their own purposes, right? For academic publications in journals and conferences, we think that the short form data statements should be a requirement for publication, implemented with care to prevent the barriers to access that we were noting in the value scenario. And also, we want people to not have this count against the page limit, right? You already don't have your references count against the page limit in NLP conferences. We think the data statement should also be in that scenario. So there may be security and secrecy concerns for some groups in some situations. There may be data sets that are created where people don't want to expose this information. There may be groups who are willing to share data sets but not the demographic information for fear of a public relations backlash or to protect the safety of the contributors to the data set. You might guess that I think one of those is a good reason and the other one is maybe not such a great reason. And based on the possibility of someone not sharing demographic information for fear of a public relations backlash, I'd like to point out that as consumers of data sets or of products trained with data sets, NLP researchers, developers, and the general public would be well advised to use systems only if there is access to the information that we propose should be included in the long-form data statement. All right? Basically, if this becomes well enough adapted and standardized, you can say that system looks fishy if you're not telling me what it's trained on. I'm going to avoid it. Okay, so to conclude this part, people working in NLP are now working on technology that's in widespread use. We've gone from something fairly obscure to something completely everyday, and that brings responsibilities. We have an obligation to consider the ethical implications of our work, but if we don't have regular practices, things that we can do and pick up and say, okay, now it's time for me to develop my data statement, or now it's time for me to do similar other practice, it's not going to become something that we can actually do as part of our day-to-day work. So we've put forward one specific concrete proposal, which we believe will help with issues related to exclusion and to bias in language technology, and that is the NLP data statements. In the short term, we think this foregrounds how our data does and doesn't represent the world and the people that our systems will impact. In the long term, we think that research that specifically addresses issues of bias and exclusion so is better, and data statements will promote that, and also promote the development of more representative data sets, and make it easier and more normative, that is normal practice, right, for researchers to take stakeholder values into account in designing things. Also, when we foreground the information about the data we work with, we can work towards making sure that the systems we build work for diverse speakers, and also towards making sure that we're not teaching computers about the world based on the worldview of just a subset of people. Okay, so continuing on the value of data statements, we see benefits for science, industry, and society. In science, we're going to have better validity because we're going to have more clear statements of just exactly how things can generalize. In industry, we think this will ensure the kind of conscientious software development that protects companies' reputations. Right? So companies want to move fast and break things, but eventually you run into reputational harm. Right? So if you can develop practices and then use those practices, that's better in the long term for the company and the public. So it protects their reputations by avoiding public embarrassment, and makes them more competitive by creating systems that are used more fluidly by more people. Right? As NLP technology is looking to break into new markets, not everyone out there is an American English speaker. Right? We want stuff that works broadly. And then we see, for society, benefits as well. We see NLP data statements as one piece of a larger collection of practices that will enable the development of NLP software that equitably serves the interests of users and indirect stakeholders. And that is the future that we would like to build towards. All right, so in a nutshell for this part of the talk, NLP data sets come from people, the speakers, the annotators, the curators. But those people aren't and can never be representative of the full populations that our technology impacts. And that mismatch leads to potential real-world harms, so we make a practical suggestion that makes it easier for us to reason about those harms and mitigate them, leading to better science and more ethical practice. Okay, so hopping back up to the outline for the whole talk, did overview of motivations, talked about teaching ethics in NLP, and then one proposed best practice. Data statements. Just a couple slides in conclusion. On Twitter, over a year ago, I found this tweet in my notifications. Paging the ethics and NLP crew, and then he tagged Dirk Hovey and me, talking about something that Amazon was doing that was sketchy. Right? Amazon considering giving developers access to raw transcripts of what people say when using Alexa apps. All right, so this is a privacy breach. Right? So I got paged. I thought about it for a little while. Thought about it for about how long? Do I have a date on my tweets? Thought about it for about a day. And there was something that was bugging me about this tweet. And so I came back with, I'm totally happy to be associated with serious thought about ethics and NLP, but something has bugged me about being paged. Right? And I think I figured it out. The other FNLP organizers, so this was the workshop in ethics and NLP, and I aren't the ethics and NLP police, and nor is it our job to keep everyone in line. These issues are for everyone to be aware of and work on. And then I end by saying, I'm pretty sure that's not what he meant, but I felt like I wanted to get it off my chest. What's going on here is, yes, there are people who are starting to specialize in this for part of our research work, and that's wonderful. but it's not the sort of thing that can just be foisted off on a subgroup of people. It's not just concerns for a few, but we have to get to a point where this is something that everyone thinks about as part of their practice, even if it's not your research focus. And one of the temptations is to say, what's the right answer? What's the thing that I do to make sure it's correct? And that's never going to be the answer, because these issues are complicated and they interact with society and the values of many different groups of people in complex ways. And so we have to be prepared to engage with the issues actively rather than just checking boxes. All right, so what are the next steps? I'm going to continue to work on integrating ethics into the curriculum for the master's program that I run. I'm planning to propose a tutorial for next year's ACL conferences, hopefully they'll take me for Italy, on actually putting ethics into NLP courses. The idea is to work with other people who teach this to work together on ideas about how to best integrate it into the curriculum. I'll probably keep giving talks like this one. And then other things that I do that I think everyone can do. If you're on Twitter, here's a couple of hashtags where these issues come up. There's workshop/content series, so the Fat Star for voting and transparency. FNLP has happened twice. It might be that it's not going to be a separate workshop anymore, that it's just getting integrated into the main conference. I know that the North American ACL is going to have something like FNLP as a theme. Hopefully it's gotten a lot of submissions. And then I just want to leave you with the question of, what else will you do? What else do you think I could do? What else could we all do? And thank you for your attention.